The afternoon they decided I was a thief, my mother-in-law was sitting 8 feet away in her recliner, and they talked about me as if the chair were empty. Glenn had a folder. Bonnie had a tone she usually saved for waiters. And Eleanor, who they were certain had stopped following conversations months ago, was following every single word. They just had not figured that out yet. I'm going to tell you what she did when she had heard enough. But first I have to tell you what the 7 years before that afternoon actually cost. Because the cost is the whole point. My name is Frances. Most people call me Fran. I am 53 years old, and for 31 years I taught second grade in a small town in central Pennsylvania, the kind of place where the Susquehanna runs the color of milky coffee after a hard rain, and half the mailboxes on the road to church have the same 4 last names. I taught 7-year-olds how to read. That is a slower job than people think. You do not teach a child to read by handing them a book. You sit beside them while they sound out the same stubborn word 40 times. And you do not sigh, and you do not finish it for them. And one ordinary Tuesday, the word just opens for them like a door. I spent 3 decades learning to be patient with people who could not yet do the thing they were trying to do. I want you to keep that in mind, because it explains why I stayed as long as I did. If you have ever been the one who stayed when staying was inconvenient, the one who quietly handled the thing nobody else wanted to handle, I think you already know the shape of this. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and whether you were ever called difficult for doing the right thing. I read them. It helps to know I am not the only one. My husband's name was Tom. We were married 27 years. He had a heart that gave out on a Sunday morning 4 years ago while he was carrying firewood across the yard, and he was gone before the ambulance reached the end of our lane. Tom had 3 siblings. Glenn, the oldest, who left for Ohio at 19 and came back twice a year, both times to be photographed. Bonnie, the only girl besides me, 2 hours south in the Lehigh Valley, who measured her love in casseroles she dropped off and stories she told about how much she did. And there had been a younger brother, Danny, who passed before I ever met the family. So it was Tom and Glenn and Bonnie, and at the center of all of it, their mother, Eleanor. Eleanor was a hard woman to win and a harder one to lose. She had been a farm wife who became a farm widow young, and she ran 80 acres and 4 children on a budget that would have folded most people. When Tom first brought me to that kitchen, she looked at me the way a person looks at a coat they are not sure will last the winter. It took years, but somewhere in those years, she decided I was hers, and Eleanor did not change her mind once she had made it up. She taught me to can tomatoes and to back a truck down a gravel lane, and to never, ever apologize for a thing I had not done. That last lesson took the longest. It is the one this whole story turns on. The trouble with Eleanor's body started about 7 years ago, the spring before Tom died. Her hands began to shake, then her balance went, and the doctor in Lewisburg said the word Parkinson's, the way you say a word you have said too many times to feel anymore. Tom and I talked for one evening about what to do, and there was nothing really to decide. Glenn was in Ohio. Bonnie had her own life and made that clear early and often. So Eleanor came to live with us. In the downstairs bedroom Tom built out a ramp for, and I became the person who knew where everything was. Here is what caregiving actually is, in case you have been lucky enough not to know yet. It is not the dramatic moments. It is the pill organizer with 28 little doors, and the way you learn to read a person's face to know if today is a good day or a falling day. It is cutting food small enough and warm enough. It is the laundry that has to be done at a temperature most people never think about. It is learning the particular sound of a body losing its footing in the next room and being on your feet before you are awake. For 7 years, that sound lived in my ears. I knew it the way I knew my own name. When Tom died, everyone assumed I would send Eleanor somewhere. Glenn actually said it at the funeral, in the church basement with a paper cup of coffee in his hand. He said, Well, we'll have to look at a facility now, Fran. You can't be expected to. And I looked at Eleanor across that basement, 80 years old and shaking and having just buried her son. And I thought about a place that would put her in a chair by a window and forget her name. And I said, she stays with me. Glenn nodded like I had volunteered for something foolish and went back to his coffee. That nod is important, remember it. For 4 more years after that, I kept his mother alive and clean and laughing some afternoons, and not one of them ever asked me how I was doing it. They only ever asked whether it was done. What I have not told you yet is that Eleanor and I grieved Tom together, in that house, just the 2 of us, which is a bond people badly underestimate. She had buried a husband and 2 sons by the time it was over, and I had just lost the only husband I would ever have. And on the worst nights, neither of us bothered to perform being all right for the other. She would hear me crying in the kitchen and call my name, and I would go sit on the edge of her bed, and sometimes we did nothing but hold hands in the dark and say his name back and forth, like it was a prayer that needed 2 voices to carry it. You do not build a thing like that with a person and then quietly believe you robbed her blind. But that is exactly what they were asking the whole family to believe, and for a long while, the whole family obliged. I paid for things. I want to be plain about that because it becomes the knife later. Eleanor had a small pension, and Tom had left me the house and a little, and the line between her money and our household just dissolved, the way it does when you are living one life in one kitchen. I bought the ramp lumber. I bought the lift chair when she could no longer get up from the couch. I paid the propane that kept her room at the temperature her thin blood needed, which was warmer than I could afford and warmer than I would ever have run it for myself. I did not keep a ledger because she was not a tenant. She was my husband's mother, and then, after he was gone, she was just my mother, the only one I had left. You do not invoice your mother. What I did keep, without meaning to, was a kind of inventory of the things I set down to do this. I had planned to retire at 55 and drive across the country with Tom, the 2 of us and a road atlas and no schedule. I had a Thursday night reading group I had belonged to for 11 years, and I let it go, because Thursday nights were when Eleanor's restlessness was worst. I had a body of my own that I stopped tending, and my own doctor told me my blood pressure had climbed and asked me, gently, who was taking care of the caretaker, and I laughed because it was such a strange question. Nobody was. That was not a complaint. I chose it. But I wanted on the record that the choosing was real, so that when they later called it a scheme to get at her pension, you will understand exactly what a person gives up to run a scheme like that. You give up everything you are going to be. It is the most expensive robbery in the world, and the only person it robs is you. There was a morning that second winter, before Tom died, that I think about when I need to remember why. Eleanor had had a bad night and woke confused, not knowing the year, frightened of her own room. And I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was the thing I had done for 30 years with a frightened child who could not find a word. I did not correct her. I did not quiz her on the date to prove to her that she was slipping. I just talked to her, low and steady, about the tomatoes we would can come summer, the same tomatoes she had taught me to put up 20 years before, until the fear let go of her and she came back to herself and knew me again. When she surfaced, she gripped my wrist and said, "I'm so much trouble. I'm sorry." And I said the thing she had once taught me to say. I said, "Don't you apologize for a thing you didn't do." Neither of us knew yet how much I was going to need that sentence. The first time I felt the ground shift was at a cousin's wedding, the second autumn after Tom. Bonnie cornered me by the gift table and said, in a voice pitched for the women nearby to hear, "It's just so generous of you to let Mom stay, especially with her money helping out the way it does." And she smiled, and I understood, slowly, the way you understand a word a child has spelled wrong on purpose. that a story was being written about me that I was not the author of. In that story, I was not the woman who had given up 7 years. I was a woman who had gotten her hands on an old lady's pension. I went home and lay awake. I told myself I had heard it wrong. I had not heard it wrong. Over the next 2 years, the story got built, brick by careful brick, and I watched it go up and could not stop a single brick from landing. It is the strangest kind of helpless, being slandered politely. There is nothing to push against. Glenn would call Eleanor on speakerphone and ask, loud, "You doing okay there, Mom? You getting everything you need?" in a tone that suggested she might be a hostage. Bonnie started asking pointed questions about the propane bill, the grocery receipts, whether Mom really needed the homemaid who came 2 mornings a week so I could buy groceries and breathe. When I explained an expense, the explaining itself became evidence. A woman with nothing to hide does not explain so much, the story went. See how defensive she gets? There was an Easter at Bonnie's house that told me exactly where I stood, if I had been willing to read it. I had gotten Eleanor up and dressed and into the car at dawn and driven the 2 hours, which by then was a half-day operation, so that she could be with her family on a holiday. When we arrived, Bonnie took her mother's arm and swept her off to the cousins, and I came in behind carrying the 2 dishes I had cooked, the bag of her medications, and the folding wheelchair. A niece I had known since she was in diapers asked me, not unkindly, whether I could keep an eye on the iced tea. Not asked me as family, asked me the way you ask the person hired to work the party. So I refilled the iced tea. I cut Eleanor's ham small enough for her to manage while everyone else just ate. And somewhere in that long, bright afternoon, I finally understood that in this family's picture of itself, I was not a woman who had married in and stayed. I was an outsider who had gotten above herself. The strange thing about being treated like the hired woman by people whose mother you bathe every single morning is how perfectly reasonable they manage to make it sound while they are doing it to you. And the cruelest part, the part I still turn over, is that it worked on me too. That is what these things do. After enough months of being looked at like a suspect, I started to audit myself. I started keeping receipts, not for them, but because some frightened part of me needed proof for a jury that had not yet been called. I would lie in bed and run the numbers like one of my old students checking a sum, and I would think, did I take too much? Did I let the lines blur because it was easier? Am I the person they say I am? I had given 7 years of my one life to a woman who could no longer wipe her own chin, and these people had me lying awake wondering if I was a thief in my own house. I want you to sit with how that is possible, because if it has happened to you, you are not crazy and you were not weak. It is a thing that can be done to anyone patient enough to be useful. I kept the receipts in a shoebox that had once held a pair of Tom's work boots, and the box filled, and I started a second one. There were nights I sat on the kitchen floor with both boxes open around me, sorting curled paper by year, building a defense for a trial that no one had formally called. And I would catch sight of my own reflection in the dark window over the sink, a grown woman on the floor at midnight, surrounded by grocery receipts, trying to prove she was not a criminal in the house where she had buried her husband. I never knew whether to laugh or be sick. That is what the polite version of this does to a person. It does not only take your good name, it climbs inside you and makes you the prosecutor too. It escalated the way these things always do, climbing from the things that were outside me toward the things that were closest. First it was talk at the edges of family events. Then it was being left off the email chain when Glenn started sending around messages about Mom's care plan, as though I were not the entire care plan, as though I were a vendor on the account. Then Bonnie began calling Eleanor's doctor's office directly to check on things. I learned about it the way I learned most of it, sideways and too late. I had brought Eleanor in for her quarterly visit, the visit I had scheduled, with the list of her medications I kept current in my own handwriting. And the nurse said, "Oh, your sister-in-law called ahead. She had some concerns," and handed me a printout. It was a page of questions Bonnie had submitted. Whether Eleanor was being over-medicated, whether she was being properly fed, whether she was safe in the home. I sat in that little room with the paper on the exam table crinkling under me and read a list of polite accusations dressed up as a daughter's worry, while the actual daughter, who had not adjusted one of those medications or cooked one of those meals, sat 2 hours south waiting for the report. The doctor, who had known me for 7 years, looked at me over his glasses and said nothing, but he did not really have to. I drove home with Eleanor asleep against the window and understood that they had found themselves a fresh room to tell the story in, one with my name in the chart and my hands nowhere in it. They were peeling me off her life, one strip at a time. And every time I objected, even gently, the objection was filed under proof that I was controlling, that I was difficult, that I had something to protect. There is no defense against that frame. The calmer you are, the more they say you are hiding. The more upset you get, the more they say you are unstable. The frame eats everything you do. The brick that finished the wall was the accounts that winter Glenn got himself added to Eleanor's bank account to help manage things, and started going through 7 years of statements like an auditor who already knew the verdict. And of course, it was a mess, because it was a life, not a business. There were the grocery runs that included our food and her food on the same receipt. There was the check I had written to the roofer the year the bedroom ceiling leaked over her bed. There was cash I had taken out to pay the aid, to a man sitting in Ohio with a highlighter and a grievance. It all looked like one thing. He called Bonnie. Bonnie called the rest of the cousins, and the word that had been floating in the soft, deniable form of generous arrangement finally hardened into the one they had meant all along: stealing. Fran has been stealing from Mom. Nobody said it to my face for a long time. That is the thing about a whisper campaign. You feel the temperature drop. You feel people who used to hug you go stiff. You hear conversations stop when you walk into the church kitchen, and you have nothing to hold. I would catch Eleanor's old friend Dot looking at me with a question in her face she was too kind to ask. I started to dread the phone. I lost weight without trying. And the whole time, I kept doing the actual work, the pills and the laundry and the falling and the warm room, because the campaign against me did not pause Eleanor's body for even one afternoon. She still needed me at the exact rate she had always needed me. Slander does not do the dishes. There was a night I almost left. I will tell you about it because I think it is the most honest part. It was February, ice on the inside of the storm door, and I had just gotten off a call with Bonnie where she had said, sweet as anything, "We just think it might be time for Mom to be somewhere she's really cared for, somewhere objective." Somewhere objective, as if 7 years of my hands were a bias. After she hung up, I went and stood in the dark kitchen, and I genuinely thought I could be done. I could pack a bag, drive to my sisters in Harrisburg, and let them put Eleanor in a facility and fight over her pension and find out for themselves what a Tuesday with her actually weighs. I had the keys in my hand. I want to be honest that I had the keys in my hand. And then the sound came from the back bedroom. The particular sound, not a fall that night, just Eleanor calling my name the way she did when a bad dream had her, small and frightened and certain, the way one of my second graders would call out, not for a parent in general, but for the one specific person who would come. "Fran, Fran." And I put the keys down on the counter and I went, the way I had gone 1,000 times. And I sat on the edge of her bed and held her shaking hand until her breathing slowed. And she looked up at me in the dark and said, clear as a bell, "It's only ever you." I have thought about that sentence every day since, because she was not confused when she said it. She was the least confused she had been in months. She knew exactly who showed up. They had all decided she was too far gone to know anything. She knew everything. That was when I stopped, but not the way you might think. I did not start planning a confrontation. I did not gather my receipts into a weapon. What I changed was smaller and harder. I stopped defending myself. I stopped explaining the propane bill. I stopped answering the pointed questions, stopped narrating my own innocence to people who had already convicted me. When Glenn called with that hostage rescue voice, I handed the phone to Eleanor and let them talk, and I left the room. When Bonnie asked her questions, I said, "You're welcome to look at anything you like," and I went back to the laundry. I stopped standing between this family and the truth of what it actually was. I had spent 2 years cushioning them from how little they did by overproving how much I did, and I just set that job down. If they wanted to believe I was a thief, I was not going to spend my evenings auditioning to be acquitted. I had a woman to take care of. That was the only job I had agreed to. Those were lonely months, the ones after I set the defending down. The phone mostly went quiet. The cousins I had cooked for and prayed beside drifted off, and a couple of them, I found out later, had been told outright that I was being investigated, which was a generous word for a man in Ohio with a highlighter. Only Dot stayed steady. Eleanor's oldest friend, 79 years old, would drive over on Wednesdays with a coffee cake and sit with Eleanor so that I could sleep 2 hours in the afternoon. And one of those Wednesdays, she caught my hand at the door and said, "I've known that family 50 years, honey. Don't you let them tell you who you are." She did not know yet about the mornings she herself would matter to this story. She was just an old woman who could see, the way old women can, which person in a room is doing the actual carrying. I held on to that sentence the way you hold a railing in the dark. What I did not know, what none of us knew, was that Eleanor had been doing some quiet work of her own. The afternoon it came to a head was a Thursday in March. Glenn drove in from Ohio, and Bonnie came up from the valley, and they arrived together, which they never did. And I knew from the way the 2 cars pulled in nose to tail that this was a planned thing. They came into Eleanor's room, where she was propped up in the bed now most of the day, and they did not really greet her, and they did not greet me at all. Glenn had the folder. He set a kitchen chair in the middle of the room, sat down facing me with the bank statements on his knee, and Bonnie stood by the window with her arms crossed. And they began. I will not give you every word, because the words do not deserve to be repeated that carefully. The shape of it was this. They had reviewed the accounts. They had found, by their math, tens of thousands of dollars they could not account for over 7 years. They had spoken to a lawyer. They felt, given the situation, that it would be best if I moved out of the house Tom left me, and if Mom went to a managed facility where her finances could be protected. And if I would be reasonable, they were prepared not to make this any more unpleasant than it had to be. Glenn actually used the phrase, "We'd hate to have to involve anyone." He said it looking at his folder, not at me. Bonnie added, to the window, that she had always wondered how I afforded to keep Mom so comfortable. And the whole time, they spoke about Eleanor in the third person, 3 feet from her face. How Mom needs, what's best for Mom, as if she were a topic, as if she were furniture. I sat in the chair across from Glenn, and I felt the old urge rise up, the urge to open my own folder, to lay out 7 years of receipts, to make them understand. I felt the second-grade teacher in me wanting to walk them through it line by patient line until the word opened for them. And I let the urge pass because I had already learned that explaining was the trap. So I just said, quietly, "I'm not going to argue with you about whether I'm a thief. I know what I did in this house. You weren't here to see it, and that's not my failing." And I started, in my own head, to make peace with leaving. I really did. I thought, I will go to my sisters, and I will grieve this family the way I grieved Tom, and I will know what I know. And that is when Eleanor spoke. She had been so quiet that they had genuinely forgotten her, which tells you everything about how they saw her. Her voice was not loud. Parkinson's had taken the volume out of it years ago, but the room was dead silent. And so the whole room heard her say, "Glenn, bring me the green folder from my dresser." Glenn turned around like the recliner had spoken. "Mom, you should rest. This is grown up." And she cut him off. And there was the farm widow who had run 80 acres on nothing, still in there under the shaking. The green folder, now. He went and got it because 40 years of being her son does not leave you, even when you have decided she is too far gone to matter. She made me help her open it because her hands could not. And I did not yet know what it was. It was the work she had been doing 8 months earlier. On one of the mornings, the home aide came and I ran to the store. Eleanor had had Dot drive her to the lawyer in town, the same lawyer her husband had used 50 years before. And in clear and documented mind, she had put her affairs in order. Openly, properly, with witnesses who would swear to her competence. She had left the bulk of what little she had to me, to Francis, who stayed. And she had written down, in the lawyer's careful language, exactly who had cared for her and exactly who had not. And she had done it precisely because she suspected this day was coming. She had watched her own children build the case against me, and she had quietly built the truth on the other side of it. And she had told no one, not even me, because she wanted to see what they would do. But the green folder was not the part that broke them. Money never is. The part that broke them came after, when she had me close the folder again, and she looked at her 2 living children, and she said the thing she had been saving. She said, "I had 4 children. Danny died, Tom died, and the 2 of you have been waiting 7 years for me to die, so you could fight over a farm you wouldn't drive 4 hours to see me live on. This woman bathed me. This woman knows which pills. This woman heard me when I called in the night, and you didn't even know I called." She looked at Glenn with the bank statement still on his knee, and she said, "You came home twice a year to stand in the front yard. You don't even know which side of the bed I sleep on. And you came up here today to call her a thief in my own bedroom while I was lying right here. You thought I couldn't follow it. I followed all of it." There was no shouting. That is what I want you to understand about how it actually felt. There was just an old woman in a bed telling the truth she had been holding for 2 years, and 2 grown adults discovering, in real time, that the person they had written off as gone had been the only fully awake person in the family the whole time. Glenn's face did a thing I had never seen it do. The folder slid off his knee and he did not pick it up. Bonnie uncrossed her arms and put a hand over her mouth and said, "Mom, we were only trying to protect you." And Eleanor said, very softly, "From the only person who showed up." And then she said she was tired, and she would like everyone but Fran to leave her room. They left that afternoon. Glenn drove back to Ohio that same night, 8 hours in the dark, rather than sleep one more night in the house. Bonnie stayed in a motel and was gone by morning. Neither of them said sorry to me. Not really. Not in a way that cost them anything. But it did not matter, and I think that is the gift Eleanor actually gave me, larger than the green folder. I no longer needed them to say it. For 2 years, I had been auditioning for the verdict of people who were never qualified to judge me. And a woman with a failing body and a perfectly clear mind had just dismissed the entire jury. Here is the cold part, and I am not going to dress it up, because it is the truest thing in the story. Glenn and Bonnie did not lose a court case. They lost their mother while she was still alive to be lost. Eleanor lived 19 more months after that Thursday, and in all of them, she did not once let Glenn back into the room when he visited. And he did visit, more than twice a year now, suddenly attentive, suddenly available. She would let him stand in the doorway and she would say, kindly, because she was not cruel, "You can go on home, Glenn. Fran's got me." And he would have to take the 8-hour drive back, knowing the door had been open and he had stood outside it for 40 years and only knocked when there was a farm at the end of it. That is a thing he gets to carry now. They wanted to be the family that protected Mom from the stranger. They got to be the family Mom protected herself from. They did it to themselves. I just stopped standing between them and the truth of what they had done. Eleanor died in that downstairs room 2 springs ago, on a good day, a falling light kind of afternoon, with her hand in mine and the propane keeping the room warm enough for her thin blood the way it always had. The last full sentence she said to me was not dramatic. She looked at the window and said, "You always did keep it warm enough in here." I have decided that was her saying she saw all of it. The bills, the years, the warm room I kept warmer than I could afford. She saw it, and that is more than most people who do this work ever get. I taught 2nd grade for 31 years. So let me tell you the thing I told 100 classrooms of children who thought that the loud kids were the smart ones and the quiet kid in the back row had nothing to say. Quiet is not the same as empty. The person who does not announce what they are doing is very often the only person actually doing it. Eleanor was quiet for 2 years while a story was told about me, and everyone mistook her quiet for absence. And they were wrong, the way they are always wrong about it. If you are the one who stays, the one being slandered politely while you do the actual work, I need you to hear the one thing it took me 53 years to learn. You do not owe anyone the audition. You do not have to prove you are not a thief to people who decided the verdict before the trial. Keep doing the real work. Set down the job of cushioning them from themselves, and let the quiet ones who actually saw you speak when it is their turn. Somebody saw you. Somebody was awake for all of it, even on the nights you were certain no one was watching. And when it finally matters, the quiet one in the back of the room is going to raise her hand and tell them exactly what she saw.